Before I speak, I wanted to tell you that this book by Narayani Anaya, many of you heard me talk about it last spring because I went to Spain to help her finish up the manuscript. She was the woman who helped care for Swamiji at the end of his life, and in many other ways she has a great deal to tell us. So it's now available in our boutique. It's just a treasure. I can't really say enough to tell you how much you'll enjoy reading it. It's $18. This is the Indian edition. They haven't printed it in America, so we had to ship it all the way from India. Those of you who end up seeing this online, if you order it from us, please put in an extra $3 so we can ship it to you. Okay? So I'm very happy to have it there. Now, you know, the whole story of karma is really just the story of why there is such an enormous gap between our first inclination that we want to have an experience of God and all the time that seems to pass before that experience comes to us. And it's so confusing because we're so deeply sincere in what we seem to want, and yet it just never comes out the way we hope. Many, many, many years ago, at the very beginning of Ananda, Swami Kriyananda built a house on the location where, if you go to Ananda Village in Grass Valley, where Crystal Hermitage is now, and there's the living room, which is a dome. And when he first built that house in 1971, the entire house was just the dome. None of the rest of it was there. It was all very simple. And the dome was, they sprayed it with some kind of foam because the whole house was built for like a few $1,000s. But the problem with the foam was that a dome is made out of these triangular struts, and there's a tremendous amount of movement. So during the day, the dome would swell, and then when it got cold, it shrank again at night, which caused innumerable hairline cracks to form in the foam. Right now, actually, if you can examine it somehow, you'll see that they actually just built a carport over the dome. That it looks like an ordinary roof outside, because that was the result of 15 years of trying to keep it from leaking. And Swami's answer was put an umbrella over it. And it took them 15 years to finally put an umbrella over it. But in the meantime, every time it rained, and it rained about 60 inches a year in the course of 6 months. So it was torrential rains, and every time it rained, it was just like a sieve in there. And he used to keep firewood underneath the house, and there was a trap door that you would lift like this. It was a 4x8 piece of plywood. You'd lift it up like this, and you'd go down the stairs and bring the wood up from underneath. And we used to have to lift that up, and then we would literally sweep the water out of the house because it would just accumulate. And Swamiji often would teach us by teasing about attitudes that we might be inclined to take seriously, and then he would make jokes out of them at a time when we were able to laugh, so that later, when we wanted to take it seriously, we would also remember that it had been a joke, and it was a little harder to get so deep into the delusion. And Swamiji, with this dome, he would talk to us about how sincere he was in attempting to fix the leaks, that he was being so good, and he was trying so hard, and he meant so well. And yet God totally ignored all his efforts. And each time they would have some new solution, and they would try it, and then the rain would come, and he'd be there sweeping the water out. And it was just completely hopeless, really, for years and years, until finally they just put the umbrella over the whole thing. But in truth, I mean, what Swami would say, he says that it really didn't matter how sincere I was, because there were holes in the roof and the rain came in. You know, it wasn't a matter of opinion. It wasn't a matter of attitude. It wasn't a matter of God loving him or not. If there are holes in the roof and it rains, the rain will come in. And what goes on in our personal lives, and it's confusing for us because we are sincere. And we deeply want, what we have committed ourselves to. But there's holes in the roof. And the holes are holes we ourselves punched, at other times before we got to here. All the things that happened ahead of time just created this certain construct. And there is a solution, but that solution isn't created just because we're nice. We're just so nice. When at different times in Ananda's history, I've been working, as many of you know, on this long historical record. And in 1981, Ananda purchased this piece of land that was right in the middle of our community for all these years. And then we finally bought it, and it was just a random 40-acre parcel that was separate. But when we tried to get it incorporated into our master plan, we had this tremendous opposition from the neighbors. And Swami, we just decided we'd had it, that the people who had no sympathy for our cause had too much influence. So we had a woman named Dallas Atkins, who was an attorney who was living there, research, what is the path to freedom? And the only entity, less than a county, that had control over its own land use was a municipality, a city. We started calling ourselves Ananda City, S-I-D-D-H-I, which means divine power. Ananda City, we called ourselves, was a municipality. We were a farm a rural place of some 800 acres with about 150 people living on it. But law being just a matter of logic and not a matter of common sense, we actually qualified to be a city. So we went through this 18-month process trying to incorporate our little community as a California city. I was to be the mayor. Gary's brother Ananta, from the moment we started, always called me, Her Honor, Madam the Mayor. That was it. Whenever he would see me coming, he would be like the town crier. Her Honor, Madam the Mayor, he would say like this, and he would lead all his people, and they would salute me. We had a lot of fun. So we went through this crazy 18-month cycle because everybody opposed it. In the end, we had a hearing of 800 people that lasted from 7 at night till 2 in the morning. And all of those people were against it, except us. Our little coterie there. It was a really interesting experience, to be sure of what you're doing and then have everyone else disagree. It's called persecution. It's a marvelous experience. Because you get to ask yourself, why do I believe what I believe? Am I just doing this because it was the way the river was flowing and it's easy, and now if there's a branch in the way, I'll just go in another direction? We got to do it again in our community in 1994 to 1998 when we had a huge lawsuit against us that was in the Redwood City Courthouse. And everybody was telling us that we were just deceived and confused, and that even if we thought what we were doing was good, it was just because the people who were tricking us were so clever that we just didn't know. It's not a joke when it happens, because it kind of goes in you and forces you, to the extent that a person relies upon external confirmation. When that external confirmation is challenged, it drives you deeper and deeper and deeper into yourself. Now, the karma of persecution is not the same as personal karma. It's an important thing to understand. Personal karma is when I myself in some way have acted contrary to divine law, and now a force is coming that is going to push me back into harmony with divine law, or balance the record, as I've talked about before, pay the debt. Persecution is that we've been doing everything right, but we need to have more inner strength than we had. So it's not a question of one's flaws, It's just a question of being given the opportunity to become stronger and stronger. When we were being attacked in the 90s like that, and someone said we ought to have a day of atonement and introspection, Swami said, absolutely not. He was emphatic, which seemed contrary, didn't it? He said, this has nothing to do with any of us personally. This is a challenge to our commitment to being Master's disciples, come what may. Now, all of the karma that we always face is always a challenge. Who am I? What do I believe? Do I love God? And if so, why? What is the basis of it? And there's always this gap that God is trying to push us through. And, much of our lives, we live in a prosperous country. We live in a place where it's relatively easy to live. I mean, I'm talking about compared to parts of the world where there's war and famine and complete lack of opportunity. We're relatively comfortable. But nonetheless, all of us find ourselves, one way or another, whatever we're relying upon outwardly, if we are, in fact, deeply sincere, God keeps raining into those cracks. And it just keeps pouring through. And the spiritual path is, we're looking at Narayani's book, because Narayani's life with Swami began in 2003. So she lived the last 10 years with him. And she saw Swami in a different way, because those last 10 years was really the time when his consciousness, when he began to release all, the word I want is pretense. Prior to that last decade, he presented a persona that was more like the rest of us. Hardly, but more like the rest of us, in the sense that he was outwardly engaged, he had a dynamic personality, and he participated, and he just kept up a facade of involvement with this world. Increasingly in those last years, especially after Narayani really entered his life, he basically just surrendered to her, really, all necessity to relate to this world, and just allowed himself. He just cut the tethers. He just allowed his consciousness to go free. But what was so interesting about that is the more he stopped pretending, the more simple and childlike his energy became. And she tells a story in there that's really so sweet. And it was sort of a whole period of time, but this was how she described it. Where Swamiji, his behavior became somewhat unpredictable. And he began to isolate himself a lot more from people, whereas he'd always kept a lot of coming and going. He began to be more solitary. But he explained it in this way. Essentially, he said, I'm so much in everybody's consciousness. He said that I'm just too sensitive. I can feel, all that they're going through. And he said, it's really more than I can bear a great deal of the time. And he sort of asked her to protect him a little bit while he called it a transition. And in fact, he became only a little more comfortable. But let's see, how do I want to say this? Most of us spend a great deal of our time protecting ourselves from our own tender hearts. We build personalities of so many different kinds. We become clever, we become, effective and all these different things. We just build all these personalities. And without even knowing it, when things come at us that are too much for us to handle, we just put up that energy like this. These are the thwarting cross currents of ego that are referred to in our readings. We have all these different aspects of our nature that hold the world at bay. And of course, we live in a world in which a great deal of it we don't want to take in. I remember when I had been living at Ananda in 1971, when I moved up there from San Francisco, and I lived at what is now the seclusion retreat, which is an extremely isolated place. Even now it's isolated, and then it was stunningly isolated. It snowed a lot, and we didn't even have a four-wheel drive vehicle, so a lot of times we just couldn't even get out of there. No electricity, no communication system, zero. I mean, it was bliss. It was really terrific. Just completely in this world like this. And after about 6 months of hardly leaving the property, I had this tremendous sense of increased energy. And what I realized was that my entire life from my childhood, I was always protecting myself. I was a perfectly well-adjusted person, but I was always protecting myself because that whole world that I lived in, the vibration of it was not the same as mine. And of course, as we get older, as we go out and take jobs and just travel down the street and go to restaurants and parties and all the things that we do, this psychic shield becomes so habitual we don't even know it's there. And when I was living at Ananda for those months, just slowly, I literally became aware of the fact, I remembering, feeling this, that this was not a place I wanted to resist, but this was a place I wanted to absorb. And so that shield that I didn't even know was there gradually began to melt in that. And all that energy which I was always using to keep the bubble around me, just all that energy was freed. Now, I lived in that protected environment, not as quite as isolated as those first years, for like 16 years. And then was asked to come here, which is, this is hardly purgatory. It's hardly purgatory. But it's very mixed vibrations. I remember living in this little rental house, and the landlord had somebody come and mow the lawn. And I looked out the window, and there was someone about 3 feet from my window, and I didn't know who that person was. I mean, that seems so normal, doesn't it? It shocked me. Because I was so accustomed that anybody who came into my space was somebody that I knew, right? And that I was compatible with. Okay, but it's not enough to be delicate. I spent a great deal of my life being proud of how delicate I was. I thought it was a virtue. I'm so, after all, sensitive. But then one day I realized that was not a divine quality. To judge everything else as inferior to me, to think that I had this refined nature that was just too pure to be touched by any of this. I realized that's exactly the opposite. Because the masters don't hold themselves aloof. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. I mean, what would it be like if Master came here and just said, well, you're not worthy, and you're not worthy, and you're not worthy, and you're not worthy? Swamiji once said, just jokingly, he said, of course you're not worthy. He said, just assume it. Of course we're not worthy. That's the whole astonishing thing about the love God gives us, is that we don't have to earn it. It isn't a question of getting good enough. It's that it's just there. It's just ours. And what God is really asking of us is to let down our guard completely and just allow God to love us. It's such a paradox, because that's what we're all wanting, isn't it? We all have this unbearable, almost unbearable desire to be loved. Unbearable because it's so fundamental to our nature. And through all these incarnations, it's been disappointed so many times that it's always there. And Swamiji takes it even a step further. the last book he wrote was, he rewrote the novel by Marie Corelli, which he'd published 100 years ago, which was called The Life Everlasting. It was a very, very romantic story of a man and a woman who through many incarnations finally come together, and then they have this perfect love, and they get on his yacht and they sail off into the sunset, just the two of them forever. Swami said, that sounds more like hell to me than heaven. But the story was also beautiful in many ways, but not quite. So Swamiji rewrote it. And he wrote it, it's called Love Perfected, Life Divine. It's really quite an interesting book to read. It's beautiful. Where he spiritualized the romance. And he lifted it much higher. And instead of sailing off to be alone together for the rest of their lives, they commit themselves to helping others, which is a bit more expansive as an ending. But in the course of writing that, we had this conversation. Actually, it was long before, but we had this conversation. He said to me, God has promised every desire we have, before God realization comes, it must be fulfilled. This is something that Master said, which is really terrifying. Every desire that you have, it has to be fulfilled. Because otherwise you keep wanting it. God is all in all, but if you still desire this, it will distract you. You have to find out whether or not it will make you happy, and then recognize its limitation and let it go. They're not ripped away from us. We recognize that we don't want it anymore and we let it go. So Swamiji said, the deepest desire in people's hearts, he said, is to be loved. And then Swami said, not merely impersonally by God, but personally by one other human being. And he said, God would not plant that desire in our hearts if he didn't also intend to fulfill it. And then he talked about soulmates, which is a very subtle part of the spiritual path, which Master also talked about, but only once. Master talked about it one time because he knew that if he talked about it too much, no one would hear anything else that he said. It would all become the desire for that kind of personal love. He talked about it when he was interpreting the Bible, when he came to the verse, that which God has joined together, no man can put asunder. Which has later been interpreted to mean you shouldn't get divorced. But that isn't what Master said. He said everything in creation is dual, including the soul. And that there is an other half. And before liberation comes, unity with that other half must come. But you see, physical, passionate human love is the exact opposite of that kind of perfect divine love. That's affirming differences and trying to create unity in the wrong way. But that kind of love is what comes to us when we have finally come to peace at the center. When we're no longer leaning and pulling, but have come to a complete surrender to the fact that God would not give me a desire that he didn't intend to fulfill. Now think how deeply centered we would be if we really knew that. How much of our energy is reaching out? Isn't it just always reaching out? Now, what I was wanting to say about the way Swami talked to me about it on that particular occasion, the way I saw him at the end of his life, he was so unprotected. There was just nothing left to protect. Earlier in his life, he had this work to do, this tremendous work he had to do. And he was always concerned that he might not have the power within himself, the determination, the discipline, to do what Master asked him to do. So there was this aura of having to drive forward. It wasn't like he rejected, but he had to focus like this. Once he saw that was done, there was just nothing left to protect. And he was so tender about every little thing that people wanted, you know. And all of us, I included very strongly, trained myself to be tough. You know, I had to be tough. There were just so many conflicts within me, so many things I was worried about, so many things that had to be protected, despite, you know, that first cycle at Ananda of letting go. Still so much had to be protected. You know, that just only a certain amount of input could come in, because this was a threat, and that was a threat, and this was an anxiety, and that was an anxiety. And then I saw in Swami at the end, there was just nothing. You know, whatever God sends, it's all the same. Swami all his life would say that Master told him he would be liberated, that this was his last life, and that he would be free. And he often said that he would never come back. I remember we were sitting in a restaurant, he was eating a sandwich, and some awful thing had happened, just some societal awful thing, you know, just some aspect of the age we live in. And I said, "Sir, when you incarnate again, and we have to come with you, would you wait until a higher yuga? Could we come back in a higher age?" And someone was very courteous, and his mouth was full of sandwich, but through it he said, "I never intend to come back," like that. But at the end of his life, he just said, "Why would I care?" He said, "What difference would it make?" He said, "Wherever God wants me to be, that's where bliss would be." He said, how could I even have an opinion? Just like, how could I even have an opinion? That's what we're working with. Karma, to just touch back where we started, is just having all these opinions. It's called likes and dislikes. I want this, I don't like this is pleasurable, this isn't, this is hard, this is good, this is right, this isn't right. But in the end, you know, what does it matter? If God wants us there, then that's where we're meant to be. And if Swami would always talk about, doesn't matter if you suffer. I could never understand that. I would try so hard every time he would say it. You know, suffering, pleasure, pain, what difference does it make? I would try so hard to understand, and I could never understand. It mattered to me so much, whether it was suffering or not suffering. But in the end, I just got a little glimpse of it, because it's all just waves on the ocean. And whether the wave is up or the wave is down, when we're clinging so hard, it matters. But from the perspective of the ocean, it's just the smallest ripple on the top. You know, that's where we're going. And nothing less will do. It's fine if things go well. It's fine if things don't go well. It's pleasant if they do. It's unpleasant if they don't. But in the end, it's just a moment. When Swami was extremely unwell once physically, and I said to him, or someone said to him, "How do you feel, sir?" He said, "Compared to eternity, just fine." And that's what I've always remembered. Compared to eternity, just fine. That's where we're trying to go. God bless you.